Hello and welcome back to my channel. Now a few weeks ago I did a video about my 10 favourite underrated film noirs, and they were all American, and most people think of the film noir as an American genre, but actually many of the best underrated film noirs are British. Now British noir was a very small subgenre that really only happened in the very immediate war years, and I only came to know about it really from this excellent book written by Peter Woolen, who's a major film theorist and film studies writer, Paris Hollywood. And there are two essays in this book. One is called Spies and Spivs, an Anglo-Austrian entanglement, and another is called Riff Raff Realism. And they really set the canon for British noir and led me to this subgenre. And I started investigating it and I became fascinated with it. And years later, I wrote an article for a website called A Taste of Cinema. I don't know if you've come across this website. It does top 10 films, top 10 films of 2022, top 10 sci-fi movies, top 10 horror movies. And I did top 10 British noir. But when I wrote this article, I got into trouble with the editor. And the reason was, I wanted to do a top 10 British noir without mentioning The Third Man, the most famous British noir of all. And the reason I didn't want to mention it was twofold. First of all, because I've never really liked it. There you go, there's your confession for the day. I've tried so hard to like The Third Man through the years. There should be everything going for it. It's often considered one of the best British films. It's got Orson Welles giving a brilliant performance as Harry Lime. It's a brilliantly realistic, cynical film about the post-war period, about a man selling dodgy medicine in war-torn Vienna. It's beautifully shot on location in Vienna. It has this fantastic zither music by Anton Karas, wonderful actors like Alida Valli in it and Trevor Howard. So why don't I like it? But I didn't want to put it in the list because I didn't like it, but also for a second reason, because it is not typical of the British noir genre that I fell in love with. And I want to try and explain why. But I'll come to that in a minute. But so what happened was I said this to this editor, and he said, "No, you can't do that. You can't have an article about British noir without putting The Third Man in it. It's outrageous." So what I did was I wrote the article and I put The Third Man, as I'm going to do here, at number 10, right? And then built away from it. And he wouldn't have it. And he actually reordered the article and put it at number 1. Because apparently you cannot not have The Third Man as the number 1 film noir, British film noir of all time. I'm going to give you a link both to my original article and to the article that's published on The Taste of Cinema, and you'll see what I mean. But anyway, The Third Man is my number 10 in this video. I'm going to get my revenge. And it's a film with an enormous amount of talent behind it. So why don't I care for it very much? First of all, I've never much cared for Graham Greene. His sensibility, his kind of Catholic sensibility, sort of rubs me up the wrong way. And I've decided I'm going to blame him because I can't think of anything better. Joseph Cotton has never been my favourite actor. I know he's one of Orson Welles' favourite actors, but I find him rather boring. But actually, I think the main reason I don't like The Third Man is because The Third Man, of all the films I'm going to talk about today, most cleaves to the American noir, which revolves around the individual, the fatalism, the destiny of that individual, a kind of romanticised version of the world in these wonderful worlds of black and white, shadow and light, chiaroscuro. And actually what British noir provides is something very different, and that's what we're going to look at in the remaining 9 movies on this list. British noir is different because it's not so much concerned with the individual. It's not so romantic, it's not so tortured with these complex plots where some detective or private eye gets involved with some femme fatale. British noir is much more involved with British society. Here is a world that has been wrecked by bombing and war. There's a tremendous amount of poverty, there's rationing. It's a bleak world, and that's the noir of British noir. It is the bleak world that people have to live in and getting used to this post-war, austere world. And I think that's a very interesting thing that British noir explores, which The Third Man doesn't explore. It goes abroad, it's much more American, it's more self-consciously Hollywood. I always think that Carol Reed, the director, he always sort of pastiches other directors. He's kind of apes other directors. So The Fallen Idol is sort of pastiche Hitchcock. I like it very much, but. And the third man feels like Pastiche Wells to me. So, with all these kind of canted angles, which kind of gets on my nerves after a while. So, the films we're going to look at for the rest of this video are British, and they're interested in Britain. They're interested in British society more than the individuals within them. The individuals are avatars of that society. So, if we look at the 9th film I want to look at, is Waterloo Road. And I'm not talking about that awful BBC soap opera set in a school. This is a British classic, sort of forgotten these days. It was directed by the director-writing team of Frank Launder and Sidney Gilliatt, who were kind of like Powell and Pressburger types. And they made some very good wartime propaganda movies. And Waterloo Road is my personal favourite. It stars trusty old John Mills. And he comes back, he actually deserts from the army. So that's one interesting element of this film. It's a propaganda film, yet it's about a deserter. It's about a man going AWOL. And he goes AWOL in the streets of the East End of London because he thinks his wife is having an affair. And she is. And she's having an affair with the ultimate villain of British noir films, the Spiv, the black marketeer, the person who stayed at home and isn't fighting, but is profiting from the war on the black market, played here by Stuart Granger, a wonderfully oily and horrible actor, very good at doing that actually. Now what's interesting about this film and why I like it so much, and this is where British noir comes into it, is its portrait of Britain during wartime and the people fighting it. Watch this film again and look at its portrait of the East End of London. Look how diverse it is. Think about how middle class, the war films are post-war. Where Eagles Dare and the Eagle Has Landed and all these, 633 Squadron. Now go back and look at the films made during the war and look at that East End. It is full of every kind of person. There are black people, there are Jewish people, Cockneys, all on top of each other living together. It's an extraordinary portrait of London as it was and as it could be. That's the first point. The second point is the portrait of John Mills's wife in the film. She's having an affair, and the film is sympathetic to that. It doesn't demonise her. In fact, it understands her, and it encourages the audience to understand her. This is a young woman in wartime. Her husband's been taken away from her. There are all sorts of temptations around. There are urges she has. It makes her a victim, an understandable victim. And that's one of the things I think is really impressive about this film. It's a propaganda film, but it actually has someone deserting because, the matters of the heart are more important than the matters of the army, and he's a sympathetic figure. His wife is a sympathetic figure because she's having an affair, and we understand that. Even Stuart Granger, in a way, becomes almost sympathetic because he's offering her something, he's offering her some kind of escape. He's offering her some kind of charm. And it all builds to this wonderful duel between the two men, this punch-up as the drone of the enemy German aircraft comes overhead. Wonderful melodrama. It's a simple, mainstream movie. It's nothing particularly fantastic in terms of cinematic art, but it's so beautiful and humanist and warm in its sympathies. And I think it's a striking film, and it's worth reinvestigating it. It used to be one of those kind of old BBC Two in the afternoon classics. It's much better than that. Now, the 8th film, staying in London, is Pool of London. This was made in 1950. And what's interesting about Pool of London is, like Waterloo Road, it's about London. And a lot of it is set. It's filmed in and around the docks of London. And the photography is brilliant. If you like London porn, like me, and old shots of London, this is a doozy of a movie. You should definitely watch it. But it's also got an interesting plot. It's about two foreigners, sailors on leave in London. One of them falls into a sort of smuggling crime operation, and the other one falls in love. And the love story is very interesting because the actor involved is a black actor, Earl Cameron, who was arguably the first British black star, and he's having, in a romantic relationship with a young white woman. So for its time, it's quite progressive. It's right out there. And this is one of those films that it's easy to overlook in film history, but it's doing so much. And it's such a beautiful little humanist piece. And the dynamism of the robbery scene is fantastic. So if you've never seen it, get it out. Wonderful shots of London, a wonderful crime movie with a real heart to it. In seventh place, a bit of fun. A film called Noose, and it was directed by a Frenchman called Edmund T. Greville, who found himself working in London. And it's a very silly, fluffy comedy film, a little bit annoying in places, where a bunch of ex-squaddies, a bunch of soldiers from the war who've become a men's club, team up against this Italian gangster who's working in the East End. The film is full of stereotypes. So the gangster is super Italian, and then there's a French chanteuse in it. There's a kind of Rosalind Russell type press girl. It's so stupid. And Edmund T. Greville thinks the script is stupid. He clearly doesn't care. And he just uses it as an excuse for elaborate smoke and mirrors effects and Hitchcockian effects. So there's one wonderful sequence where a woman is killed off camera and it's represented by her fur stole unravelling on a stool. Very beautiful shot, actually, pure Hitchcock. And Greville are just having fun, really, with all the tricks and effects the director's got up his sleeve. It's clear that as a Frenchman, Greville is actually least sympathetic to the Englishman in the story, which I find quite amusing. He's much more interested in the Italian and the French people. And the English people are the least well characterised and quite dunderheaded. But this movie is a lot of fun. If you're willing to just enjoy an exercise in style, you'll have a lot of fun with this movie. Sixth place is Hell Drivers. Hell Drivers was a bit later in the late 1950s. Hell Drivers was made by Cy Enfield. He was an American who fell foul of the HUAC committee, the anti-communist committee set up by General McCarthy, and like many Americans came to England to make movies. He's most famous in Britain for Zulu, that classic that all English boys used to watch, about Rorke's Drift, with Michael Caine and Stanley Baker, now not watched that much anymore, unfortunately. But actually my favourite British movie by Cy Enfield is Hell Drivers. Now, Hell Drivers has got probably the most banal plot any movie has ever had. It's about a group of truck drivers working for a haulage company. And what they do to make their life more interesting, they have a competition to see who can drive their lorry the fastest down a country lane. That's it. I'm not joking. But somehow Enfield brings this American dynamism and tension to this thing. And he brings together a brilliant cast. Patrick McGowan, William Hartnell, Sid James, Herbert Lom, a young Sean Connery, and Stanley Baker. It's an absolutely incredible cast, and it's utterly riveting. It's such a great movie. You get completely caught up in it, And all these wonderful actors, most of them at the start of their career before they're famous, bouncing off each other. It's a terrific movie. It takes the sort of the little country world of England and gives it a big boost of American dynamism. I can't recommend it highly enough. Great fun. In fifth place, another British classic. This is a typical stalwart of Sunday afternoons, 2:00. You've just had your roast dinner, and you're settling down with a cup of tea. Brighton Rock. The Bolting brothers, Richard Attenborough. Could not be more British, could it? People forget that this was actually quite an edgy film for its time. It was based on a very grim book, again by Graham Greene, about knife gangs in Brighton. And what's interesting is, we've come to look at Richard Attenborough as this kind of cosy lovey of British cinema. But you know what? As a psychopath, he's exceptionally good. He's also good as a murderer in 10 Willington Place, if you've ever seen that film. But as Pinky, this kind of adolescent hoodlum, he's fantastic. And he's very well supported by William Hartnell, years before he became Doctor Who, and a crusty old patriarch. Here he's a kind of horrible gangster who spits on people's floors and he's always picking at his nails. It's a great performance. And there's a wonderful sense throughout this film. It's not as dangerous or as nasty as the Graham Greene book, but you get a real sense of the tattiness of the English seaside resort, the smell of fish and chips and stale beer and crappy pubs. And I found that when I went back to watch it again as an adult, I really fell in love with this movie. It's a great film. It really is. And it's well worth investigating if you've never watched it. And believe you me, Richard Attenborough is very different from his usual image. He's excellent in the main role. In fourth place, The Small Back Room by Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger. I don't want to talk about this movie too much because I'm doing a Michael Powell retrospective in my other videos, and I want to talk about this film at length because it is one of the most interesting films Michael Powell ever made. But what it is, Michael Powell made many propaganda films during the war. After the war, he took revenge. He took revenge on all these producers in the Ministry of Information and the film studios who tried to stymie his creativity, and he took revenge on all the bureaucrats who really ran the Second World War. Very few films in British film history have really criticised the way the British ran the Second World War. Most of the films are sort of triumphant and victorious. None of them show the reality, the crappiness of the way most of the war was run. There are only two. There's this film by Michael Powell, giving the lie to the fact that Michael Powell is just a whimsical fantasist. Actually, he knew very well what was going on in the war. And the other is How I Won the War by Richard Lester, which is a difficult film to watch, but incredibly cutting about the British during the war. This movie stars David Farrar as a bomb disposal expert. And the Germans are starting to use these new bombs on Britain. And he works for this department that's underfunded, undermanaged, in a crappy little corner of some Whitehall office. And so much of the movie is about him trying to fight through the ineptness of this department to do his job. And he finds that really he's on his own against these bombs. And the end scene is this extraordinarily tense scene where he's trying to defuse this bomb on his own on a beach as the waves are coming in and all the other people are standing back watching. Powell's metaphor for the truth of the Second World War. How Britain barely held together, just a few individuals doing their job while everyone else could only stand and watch. Very powerful noir, really. The third film I want to talk about, and this is kind of like the key British film noir, is It Always Rains on Sunday by Robert Hamer. Robert Hamer was a very gifted director. He's best known for Kind Hearts and Coronets, one of the great black comedies of British cinema. But drink got to him in the end and stifled what was a really great creativity and talent. It Always Rains on Sunday, I would say, is the ultimate British movie. It's set just after the war, and it stars the wonderful Googie Withers, one of the great actresses of British cinema, and she's absolutely wonderful here. She carries the whole film. And she's a sort of downtrodden housewife in this boring terraced house life. And what happens is a guy breaks out of prison who she was in love with in her youth, and in desperation he comes to her for help. And just for these few hours, their love is rekindled, and she tries to help him. And all the time, the dreariness, the rain, the shabbiness, the ordinariness of English life seems to trap them and obstruct them. And I think if you're a British person, there's something so haunting and familiar about this film. It's not just a movie of its time, it's a movie of all British life. But it particularly captures that desperate, austerity-ridden, ration book world of the late 40s so well. It's a great film, and you really should reinvestigate it if you've never seen it before. In second place, They Made Me a Fugitive. Oh my God, if you've not seen this film, please track it down. Let's talk a little bit about the director. He was called Alberto Cavalcanti, and he was Brazilian. And he came over to France, he came over to Paris in the 1920s and made a very famous avant-garde film called Rien que les heures. But then he was tempted to Britain by Grierson, the great documentary guru. And Grierson wanted him to bring his avant-garde talents to British documentary, which he did. And he became a leading producer and director of documentary in 1930, forgotten for many years. During the 1940s, during the war and the propaganda effort, he turned to feature filmmaking, and he was bloody good at it. And he made some of the best British movies of the 1940s. He made the famous ventriloquist dummy sequence in the horror film Dead of Night, which is one of the best mini horror films ever made. He made Went the Day Well, a fantastic propaganda film where the Germans invade this small English village and the women of the village have to fight them off. He made a wonderful musical called Champagne Charlie about music hall starring Tommy Trinder. And then just after the war, he made this noir. And this, I think, may be his greatest achievement. And it stars Trevor Howard as an ex-RAF man who, because he's fallen on hard times, is driven to crime. An extraordinary thing to put in a British movie, an extraordinary comment on where British society had gone after the war. So he turns to crime, but then he gets betrayed by this crime boss. So once he gets out of prison, he decides to find this crime boss and take his revenge. And most of the film is taken up with this odyssey back to London. It's an extraordinarily dark, witty film. There's an incredible sequence where Trevor Howard turns up at this middle-class house and tries to take shelter with this woman. And this woman thinks, this is a good chance to get rid of my husband and kill him and blame this bloke. So it's very darkly witty. And the end sequence, which is all set in a funeral parlour, looks ahead. It preempts Billy Wilder in Some Like It Hot, where all the, the accoutrement of the hearse and the coffin around the gangsters in Some Like It Hot. I can't tell you how witty and clever and intelligent and brilliantly made this film is. It's a crime that it's not better known. And if anything, if this video helps people discover it, job done. But my number one British noir is Night in the City. Like Hell Drivers, it was made by an American on the run from the HUAC committee, from the anti-communist lobby in America. He came to Britain and he made this film noir with Richard Widmark, the actor Richard Widmark, taking the lead role. And it's a very unusual story. It's about this American sort of huckster trying to move in on the British wrestling scene. He hires this old wrestler, this old grizzly old man, and they try and get into the scene, but that rubs up against the people who run the shop, and he falls foul of the criminals. There are two versions of this film. One was made for the British market, one for the American market. It was cut slightly differently, but most importantly, the two versions have a different score. And I would recommend the American version. The American score is much more dynamic, it suits the material better, it suits Dassin's style and sensibility better, and it's a much sharper film, actually. It's a much better film. And the way this film captures London, the darkness of this post-war London, is incredible. The way it captures the adult world of nightclubs and the sports arenas, and it's amazing. Googie Withers is also in it, excellent as always. The final scene near Hammersmith Bridge, which is just down the road from me, where Widmark meets his girlfriend for the last time, is so moving and so beautiful. I can't recommend this film highly enough. It's an absolute masterpiece. For me, it does for London what The Third Man did for Vienna. It doesn't have that film's rich romanticism, but actually I kind of prefer it that way, personally. I wish more people would discover it. It's such a great film, one of my favourite films of all time. So that's British noir. I've missed out some titles. Let me know if there's other British noir that you really admire, and what you think of the films I've mentioned. And if you like my content, please like and subscribe. Thanks very much.